Today's topic is grape products. Chazal said that we can't use stam yain, which is grape juice or wine that was touched or moved by someone who is not Jewish. And stam yain is the most common type of item which is Issur, which doesn't come from something living like meat or fish or dairy or insects. So stam yain is a very significant concern. As unusual ones, and grape products have all types of food uses. So people are therefore correct when they think that they should be more careful about eating something that contains grape inside of it. And at the same time, the Hashgachahs, also pay much more attention to things that have grape derivatives in them, to make sure that they're coming from the right places, and that no one is substituting a treif ingredient for the kosher one. What would be for them identical, but of course one would be kosher, one would be treif. So today we're going to talk about some of the halachic issues to do with grape products as a platform to talking about some of the examples or applications that there are for those things. Okay, so the first thing is something called Hamshachah, and that is that it's only the juice of grapes or the wine that you make out of it, which can become stam yain. But a whole grape or a crushed grape is not subject to these dinim. Now, how do you know what the difference is between a crushed grape and grape juice? The way you make grape juice is you crush the grapes and you turn them into grape juice. So the dividing line is called Hamshachah, and it means when any of the juice separates from the pulp, at that point, this batch is considered to become juice, and all of it is now subject to stam yain. But because of this rule of Hamshachah, that it's only considered juice or wine once it has Hamshachah, if you whatever you do before Hamshachah it cannot become Issur at that point. So for that reason, if you want to make, let's say for example, you want to make a smoothie that has grapes in it, that's okay, because although the grapes get crushed as part of making the smoothie, they get pulverized, but and juice actually comes out of the grape, but the juice stays mixed in with everything else, and therefore it's not a possibility of becoming stam yain because it is there was no Hamshachah. Now, commercially, an example of that is grape jam. Grape jam is made by crushing grapes and adding pectin, that's a thickener to them, and then it solidifies into what we call grape jam. And the Hashgachah, who wants to, if you want to certify a jam facility, the first thing is, what's crucial is to make sure that there's no Hamshachah in the facility. If there'd be Hamshachah in that facility, there are places where the juice separates from the rest of the grape as you crush them up, then all of a sudden we're going to need Hashgachah to make sure that it never becomes stam yain, that it gets Mevushal. We'll get to Mevushal in a second, but make sure that it never becomes stam yain. So in order to give Hashgachah without that, you need to make sure that there's no places where there's a Hamshachah where the juice separates from the pulp, and maybe make changes to the factory to make sure there will not be a Hamshachah. And then once that happens, then you just have to make visits every once in a while to make sure they didn't change the process, make sure the other ingredients are all okay, and things like that. But the idea that crushing grapes without Hamshachah can't become stam yain is how it's possible to give Hashgachah on grape jam. Now, of course, that's just as an aside, that's different from grape jelly. Jelly is usually made from grape juice. Now they would likely use Mevushal grape juice, but even so, it would be more sensitive in that the ingredient itself is sensitive to make sure they don't by mistake substitute treif grape juice. Now we're going to talk about in a minute. Excuse me. The idea that if juice is Mevushal, if it gets cooked, it can't become stam yain. So, but for right now, the logic would tell us that that cooking that happens that makes it Mevushal shouldn't be happening until Hamshachah happens. Well, because when you do Hamshachah, now it became juice, and at that point, okay, now let's make it Mevushal to say that it can't become stam yain. But that's what we would have thought logically. But Ramosha says it's not true, and he says cooking could happen even before the Hamshachah, which is a very important kula for people giving Hashgachah, because it means you could be Mevushal the crushed up grapes before they could ever become stam yain. So you're like protecting yourself, because what you're doing is you're making it that before the big work that goes on at the grape juice facility is to make sure that it becomes Mevushal before anyone it gets touched or moved in a way that make it Issur. Of course, that's the goal over here. Well, if we can make a Mevushal before it could possibly become Issur, that's great news. It means we're protected, and so that's a really big advantage, a big kula that Hashgachah is relying. So the need a mashgiach there to make sure, first of all, there's no Hamshachah, of course, and also the mashgiach to make sure that it becomes Mevushal properly to the right temperatures, etc. But assuming everything works, then he can be confident that it was Mevushal before the Hamshachah, and it was impossible, so to speak, for it to become Stamyayin. Now, people have come up with the idea and said, well, we could do the same thing to give Hashgachah for raisin juice concentrate using the same idea. Now, to mention is that raisin juice has the same halachic status as grape juice. It could become stam yain also. But the way you make raisin juice, is very different than how you make grape juice. When you make grape juice, you crush the grapes and it gets out the juice. But that doesn't work with raisins. You don't crush raisins to get the juice out of them. The most common way commercially is you cook the raisins in hot water for a while, and then all the sugars and other things come out of the raisin into the water to make a raisin juice, and then you eventually concentrate that. Now, since cooking is part of the process, at least in most facilities, the cooking is part of the process. So, assuming that the cooking temperature is high enough to qualify as mevushal, then they say it's always mutter. Why? The juice doesn't come out of the raisins for quite some time. There's no hamshachah for some time. And if the cooking is done at a high temperature, then it's sort of built into the system that the cooking will always be done before the hamshachah happens, and it'll then become samyayin. So it would seem to be very easy to make, or some take that position, that it's very easy to make raisin juice concentrate to be kosher, because if you set up the system correctly, that the temperature is high enough, the juice will become mevushal before it ever has a chance, before it has hamshachah and can become asur. That's one position. Others disagree for a couple of reasons. One is there's a shayla in the poskim whether you need hamshachah for raisin juice. That's a shayla. Whether raisin juice has the same din about not becoming considered wine until there's hamshachah. It's also not so clear exactly when does hamshachah happen for raisin juice. It's not as easy as for grapes when we say the liquid separates from the pulp. It's not so clear when the time should be is. There are also reasons to think that this kula that Moshe said about you could do bishul before Hamshachah, it could be that does not apply to raisin juice. There's logical reasons. There are reasons why that might not apply. So those who take this position, this stricter position, they would say you need to have hashgachah to me. This is the raisin juice to make sure that until it comes to the point that we're confident it had a hamshachah, and at that point, did a bishul, make sure we have to catch it and be mevushal at that point. And that would need hashgachah to make sure and didn't get touched and moved before that point happens. Okay, now let's move on to this idea of mevushal, which we talked about already. We've mentioned in passing a couple of times, and that is, grape juice or wine which is mevushal, it's cooked, cannot become stam yain even if someone who's not Jewish touches or moves it. So, because of that, until it becomes mevushal, the mashgichim will be very careful and very vigilant to make sure that it's only handled by people who are Shomer Shabbos. I'll just mention in passing, because some people make this mistake, that if it became Issur before it was mevushal, it would stay Issur forever. It doesn't get mutter when you mevushal it afterwards. Okay. Anyhow, back to being mevushal. Once it is mevushal, you need simanim and other controls to make sure that somebody doesn't substitute treif grape juice for kosher grape juice. Yes, of course you need that. But all the extra care that you do to make sure that no one touches it, or no one who's not Jewish touches or moves it, that doesn't apply anymore. So things become much simpler once it becomes mevushal. There's two differences of opinion about what it takes to be mevushal. I'll mention. One is, or Moshe says it's enough to be mevushal the juice to 175 degrees. That's good enough to make it considered to be mevushal. Others say it has to be 190 or maybe even higher than that. So that's one question, is what the temperature is. And the second is, many allow this mevushal status to be accomplished in a pasteurizer, and others say that that's not good enough for different reasons. it's the common way to do things. There's no vapors come out of it. All kinds of different possible reasons why this should not work. But again, those are two differences of opinion about whether what it takes to make something mevushal. Almost all grape juice and most wine is mevushal, and usually it says it on the bottle. It'll say it on the container, so people will know that it's mevushal. In that regard, brandy, which is distilled wine. I mean, wine. You take wine and you heat it up to the point that the alcohol boils out of it, and then you capture those vapors and you chill those vapors down until they become a liquid, and that way you get a concentrated, a higher alcohol level of a drink, and that distillation process for sure qualifies to be mevushal. So brandy is always mevushal, even if it doesn't say so on the package. It's automatic. It's sort of built into the system that in order to make something brandy, you had to have been mevushal, so it's always mevushal. There's other kinds of items that are made with brandy, like port, sherry, and other fortified wines, are made by adding brandy to wine to grape juice that's become partially fermented into wine, and it's a way of increasing the alcohol content and leaving it still as a sweeter drink. Chances are, when you make something like this, you're going to probably make it with wine that's mevushal. If the wine that's in there is not mevushal, then this is now a mixture of mevushal brandy with non-mevushal wine, and it has to do a din. And the Rama talks about this in Siman Kuf Chav Gimel Halacha Hey. So that's an unusual situation, but it is. The Rama talks about that case, and also there's a little bit of a question about what to do about whether vermouth, also if it's made from non-mevushal wine. Okay, last about this is that I've been talking about whether mevushal prevents something becoming stam yayin. The din is also wine vinegar or balsamic vinegar, which is a version of a type of wine vinegar. Is at once it is vinegar, it cannot become stam yayin. It's not because it's mevushal, but it's a similar idea, which is when you get to that stage, it can no longer become stam yayin at that point. It had been stam yayin beforehand. Then when it becomes vinegar, it stays issur. So of course, it needs hashgachah to make sure that they're using wine that was kosher, that was not stam yayin. But once it becomes vinegar at that point, and once you have it in your house, it became wine vinegar, or in your factory. Once you have it and it's wine vinegar, at that point, there's no concerns if someone who's not Jewish touches or moves it. Okay, now let's go to some things that are, I might group them together as being not issues of stam yayin. Sort of to get to understand that is the main thing we make out of grapes is grape juice, and then some of that turns into wine also, but that's the main thing we make out of it. But there are also some specialty items that are made from the seeds of the grapes, grapeseed extract and grapeseed oil. So I already told you that once some juice separates from the pulp, the whole batch of crushed grapes is now had a hamshachah, and it would become issur if it's touched by someone or touched or moved by someone who's not Jewish. So there was a time when the people who said that status only applies to the juice or the fruit, whatever is left in the pits, the peels. Those are what would be considered to have had a hamshachah. But they said the seeds, those are just the pieces of wood. They have nothing to do with wine. So the seeds would be mutter unless, of course, the seeds soaked in the juice. If they sat there for 24 hours, it's a regular din of kavush that if something sits for 24 hours in something that's not kosher, it absorbs non-kosher tam. So they looked at it as just saying, well, the seeds they're not wine. Come on, it's just a piece of wood. It's just a seed, and therefore it doesn't have the din of wine, and therefore it only comes out if it sits in the wine for 24 hours. Now, we're going to see in a second that that's not correct. But the reason why this was an important piece of information was because this item that we're talking about, grapeseed extract, is specifically made from the seeds used for white wine. The difference between white wine and red wine is that white wine is made by crushing grapes to make juice, and then quickly removing the seeds and the peels from it, and then letting that juice ferment into wine. It ferments into wine without any color to it. If you let the pits and the seeds sit in the juice for some time, then color leaches into the juice, and it becomes red wine or rosé wine. It has some color to it. So since you always make grapeseed extract from the seeds from seeds that were used in white wine, it has to do with what you're trying to extract from them. Therefore, it would be automatic that they would never have been covered. You would never leave those seeds for making white wine inside the wine, or else it wouldn't be white wine anymore. So this was the idea that said is the seeds themselves are mutter, even though Hamshachah happened to the Jews. The seeds themselves are mutter until they sit for 24 hours. Until then, there's no problem with those seeds, and therefore the extract would be mutter also. However, Shlomo Miller brought several rayas that this is not correct, and that as soon as Hamshachah happens, the seeds themselves have the status of juice, even though they seem to be not juice at all. They have the status of juice, and they become Issur as stam yain. So, according to that, when you make grapeseed extract, you have to do it the same way you make wine or grape juice, meaning nobody who's not Jewish could touch or move that until it's become Mevushal, or at least the liquid that comes out of it. They can't move it until it becomes Mevushal. And that's accepted at this point, that's what you have to do in order to make kosher grapeseed extract. Now, grapeseed extract we've been talking about, is used for health benefits people believe that it has. But something similar to that is called grapeseed oil, which is a food ingredient. It's not people believe it has health benefits to it, but it's not taken as a medicinal type item. It's more used as an ingredient, like for salad dressing. Although I've just been telling you that grapeseed extract needs to have oversight, Hashgachah, to make sure that it doesn't become stam yain, the Chassam Sofer has a tshuva where he says grapeseed oil is not included in halachas of stam yain. He has two main reasons. One is that oil is not wine. It has nothing to do. It has no similarities at all to the wine that it comes from. So he says this is not wine. This is oil. It's a different thing. And he says, and it's also, even if we were to think that it came from a seed that has the status of wine, it's nishtana. It changed very dramatically from the original juice, and so it's not connected to the juice's original status, and therefore it doesn't have anything to do with stam yain. And this is a generally accepted opinion. People have challenged it, but most accept it, and therefore they would say that grapeseed oil doesn't have the special rules of stam yain, doesn't have those. It can't become stam yain, and therefore it's obviously much easier to get have as kosher. Okay, another item which is not included in the halachas of stam yain is something called tartaric acid, which is crystals that attach themselves to the barrels that wine sits in. Some crystals form from the wine and become attached to the barrels. And once you take the wine out, these rock hard crystals can be chiseled off the barrel, and you could use them in future winemaking. They have some kind of oil, I don't remember what. And you could also use them to make something called cream of tartar, which is a food ingredient. So although this tartaric acid is made from wine, and wine meaning that could even be stam yain, the Mechaber Shulchan Aruch says that it's mutter to use that because it becomes so dry that it's almost like a piece of dirt, and any issur that was on it falls away. So you could use this tartaric acid even though it came from stam yain. Now, that's a halacha, no problem, everybody agrees to that. But the things about winemaking have actually changed a certain amount, and that caused a halacha issue. And that is, when people who make wine started using stainless steel tanks instead of wooden barrels, they found that, for whatever reason, the tartaric acid crystals didn't form on these stainless steel tanks. So they wanted to have tartaric acid, but it wasn't available because they were using stainless steel tanks. So they figured out a chemical process to get the tartaric acid straight from the peels and pits and all the other byproducts of making wine. They found a way to get the tartaric acid out of those things. So Rebelsky said, well, he looked into it and said, this tartaric acid that they make from it is just as dried out as what the stuff that comes from the wooden barrels, and therefore, so just like Shulchan Aruch says it's mutter from the wooden barrels, it's mutter from here also. Others have questioned this for practical issues and halachic issues. So what's ended up happening is that many of the large American hashgachas will accept tartaric acid from any source, even without hashgachah, because they say no problem. What could go wrong? Can't possibly go wrong. It can't possibly be stam yain, and everything is perfect with it. And others, like Israeli hashgachas and what they call hashgachas, will only take it if it was made from the same way you make kosher wine, because they say no. If you make it from these barrels, from the stainless steel tanks, not by the old-fashioned way of chiseling off the wooden things, it's not going to be kosher. It'll be stam yain. Okay, now I'm going to go through a handful of items that are made from grape. I'm going to do them in alphabetical order. These are all things that are potentially stam yain, unless someone does something special. They're going to be stam yain unless they're made properly. The first is something called ino, which is really it's a longer word. It's called, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it, inocyanina. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. Everybody calls it ino, which is a coloring agent made from grape skins. Again, each of these things I'm going to mention are things that are would be stam yain unless they're made properly, with proper hashgachah. The next is ethanol or ethyl alcohol. The way you make that is you ferment the sugar when you make alcoholic beverages. So usually the way you get the sugar is you hydrolyze a starch. You break down a starch, such as corn or wheat, to make it into a sugary item. But you can also make it from cane sugar, which would be fine, or fruit juice, such as grape juice. But if you made it from grape juice, then the ethanol or the ethyl alcohol, same thing. Then it would be issur as stam yain, again, unless there were special controls. Okay, now fermentations usually grow on some kind of a sugar or a glucose, and it's possible that sugar comes from grape or milk, like we had just mentioned. It's rather unlikely. The only time it really happens is in certain parts of the world or in certain unusual economic circumstances when this makes some kind of sense for people to be using grape or milk to make these items. If that were to happen, but then it would be issur as stam yain, or it would be milchigs, depending on how they did it. Okay, next, fusel oil. It's a byproduct of distilling alcoholic beverages. So you'd want to have hashgachah to make sure it's not being made from brandy, which is distilled wine. Okay. Now there are those who say that this whole idea that fusel oil could be made from wine, it could be, of course, it can be, but there are those who say that those would be specific. Okay, well, I'm going to skip what I'm about to say. Take that back. Okay, grape molasses is made by cooking grape juice so that a lot of the water boils out of it, and it leaves behind this syrupy liquid, which has a very high sugar content. Actually, Shulchan Aruch talks about it, but it would be. It is assumed. Okay, so it's made from cooking grape juice. If the grape juice was shaved, then it would seemingly have the same status. Isoamyl alcohol is something that could be made potentially from fusel oil. This is where I want to say beforehand is that it's typically made from petrochemicals. So there are those who argue that if it was really made from fusel oil, it would be listed as a natural fusel oil, natural isoamyl alcohol. Because if they went to the effort to make it from grape juice, and otherwise not to be concerned about it, but other people think differently, and they are concerned even if it's not specifically marked as natural. Okay, now I'm going to mention just three things that have nothing to do with the stam yain aspects of it. I just mentioned about grape products. One is that there's a debate about whether the right bracha is whether grape juice from concentrate, if the bracha is hagafen, and whether you could use it for kiddush and dalet kaisos. Briefly, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said that since it's pasteurized and concentrated, it can't ferment anymore, and that affects its status as wine in several different ways. And accordingly, if it was grape juice from concentrate, grape juice made from grape juice concentrate, he questioned whether you could use it for kiddush and dalet kaisos and what the right bracha would be on it. Rebelsky and Rabbi Felder, they brought rayas against this, and they said that no, it's still perfectly fine for kiddush and dalet kaisos, and you make hagafen, etc. So you need to ask a shayla if you have a question about which way to practice about that thing. Okay, that's the first. Number two is the Gemara says that there are certain situations when stam yain is issur b'hana'ah. The Ramah says that nowadays, since the Catholics don't use wine in religious services in a way that would make it become yain nesach. Yain nesach is wine poured for avodah zarah, and it's also midaraisa, so they don't use it in that way. that would make it us midiraisa. So then, in certain situations, it would also not be asur b'hana'ah for us. It would be asur still to drink, but it would not be asur b'hana'ah. Exactly which case it applies to is itself a whole discussion on the Practicum. So I'm being a little bit vague, but there is such an opinion. There is situations when it is not asur b'hana'ah. Okay. Last is that the term grape flavor, or even if it says natural grape flavor on a food, does not mean that it was made with grapes. Just means is that there are chemicals in here, or some natural chemicals that give this item a flavor, which has some reminiscence and some connection to the term grape, but it's likely that there's no actual grape in the chemical in this mix. So although flavors or things made with flavors need hashgachah because they could be Kashrus concerns, I don't think that those concerns are particularly the grape ones are particularly more sensitive than other flavors. They all have possible use. Could be that they came from non-kosher ingredients, but there isn't such a concern in grape more than other things that they came from grape components.